On April 17, 1984, Carl Briner stood at the back of a farm auction in Shelby County, Illinois, not because he planned to buy anything, but because he wanted to see who was losing what and how it happened. And he told himself that watching other men's mistakes was cheaper than making his own. The wind cut across the gravel lot. The auctioneer kept talking, and on a trailer near the center sat a red Case IH 2390 that had once looked powerful and now looked tired. Paint faded, one rear tire worn thin. The kind of machine people glance at and dismiss into seconds. And that morning most of the crowd had already dismissed it, because they knew whose name had been on the paperwork: Russell Hoffman, the man who had expanded too fast in the late 70s, borrowed too much, bought new equipment every other year, and then watched grain prices fall out from under him until the bank finally took everything. Carl had known men like that, ambitious, restless, convinced that scale alone would protect them, and he had chosen a different way after inheriting 480 acres of corn and beans from his father Raymond in 1978, along with a mortgage that was nearly paid, but not quite. And Carl's way had always been slower, quieter, built on survival instead of growth. So when the auctioneer called out, "Do I hear 7,500?" and nobody answered, Carl kept his hands in his jacket pockets and told himself he was only there to watch. But then the number dropped to 7,000, then 6,500, then 6, and the silence stretched in a way that made men look down at their boots rather than at each other, because everyone understood that once a machine carried the smell of bankruptcy, it carried it for good. Carl had not planned to raise his hand. He did not need another tractor. His equipment was aging but functional, and spending money he did not need to spend had never been part of his nature. Yet when the price fell to 5,000 and the auctioneer's voice sharpened, as if embarrassed for the machine, Carl felt something shift inside him, not excitement, not greed, but a simple calculation that did not match the laughter building near the fence. And before he had fully reasoned it through, he raised his hand. The auctioneer pointed, confirmed the bid, waited for 5,500, and when no one spoke, the gavel came down and the tractor was his. The laughter came a second later, low at first, then clearer, and Vernon Kloss stepped closer and said, "You bought Hoffman's junk," and another man added, "That thing'll be in pieces by fall." And Carl did what he had learned to do beside his father in fields. That did not care about opinions. He said nothing, walked to the cashier's table, wrote a check for $5,000 he could afford but would feel, folded the receipt into his wallet, and drove home. 2 days later, the 2390 was delivered and parked inside his machine shed. And for 3 weeks, Carl did not touch it, because planting season came first, and he finished with the equipment he already trusted. But on a Sunday afternoon in early May, when the fields were still damp and the house was quiet, he walked into the shed alone, climbed the ladder, and opened the engine cowling. He expected to confirm what everyone else believed, that he had made a mistake. And he began the way his father had taught him, checking the oil, pulling the dipstick once, wiping it clean, inserting it again, and what he saw made him pause, because the oil was clear, not new exactly, but far cleaner than it had any right to be. He checked the hydraulic fluid, the coolant, the fuel filters, and nothing looked neglected. He turned the key, and the engine fired on the first try, not with the uneven knock of something near death, but with a steady, even sound that did not match the story told about it. And Carl stood there listening longer than he meant to, not smiling, not celebrating, just listening. Over the next 2 days, he did what most buyers at auction would never do. He began to pull the engine apart piece by piece, not because he wanted to rebuild it, but because he wanted proof. And as he removed the valve cover and inspected the rocker arms, checked the camshaft, dropped the oil pan, and examined the bearings, he found almost no wear, and confusion replaced doubt, because worn machines do not look like this. The answer came folded inside a greasy envelope tucked behind the battery box, a place no casual inspection would ever reach. And Carl unfolded the papers slowly and read the dates: October 1982 through March 1983. Invoices from a Case IH dealer in Mattoon, listing a rebuilt cylinder head, new pistons, main bearings, turbocharger, injectors, overhauled fuel pump. line after line of parts and labor adding up to nearly $14,000. Russell Hoffman, already drowning in debt, had rebuilt the entire engine less than 2 years before the bank took the farm. Carl sat on the concrete floor of the shed with the receipts in his hands and understood something the men at the fence did not. This was not junk. This was a machine a desperate man had tried to save. Money spent he did not have in a last attempt to buy time, and the engine had been done right. Carl folded the receipts carefully and slid them back where he found them. And in that moment he made a decision that would shape the next 3 decades. Not about farming, not about money, but about silence. Because he knew he could walk into the co-op the next morning and lay those papers on the counter and watch the laughter die. But he also knew that proving a point would not plant a single acre or pay down a single bill. So he chose not to say a word. Planting season that year turned wet and heavy, and the fields became thick with mud after every rain. And it was then that the 2390 earned its place not through bragging rights, but through work, pulling a 12-row planter through soil that would have swallowed his older 2-wheel drive tractors, the 4-wheel drive holding steady where others would have spun. And Carl finished planting 3 days ahead of schedule, while other farmers were still waiting for their fields to dry. At the co-op, Vernon saw him fueling the red tractor and called out, "Still running?" And Carl answered, "Still running," and drove home. Summer came dry, the corn struggled, yields across the county fell. And when harvest arrived in September, Carl combined what he could, stored part, sold part, and covered his costs, but not much more. And through it all the 2390 did not fail, not once. In October he was working a field near the road when a pickup pulled over and a man stepped out and walked to the fence. And Carl recognized Tom Hoffman, Russell's younger brother, who stood there watching the machine for a long time before Carl shut it down and walked over. "That's Russell's tractor," Tom said, and Carl nodded, and Tom stared at it and said quietly, "He put everything into that tractor. Thought if he could just keep the equipment running, he could make it work," and there was no accusation in his voice, just fact. And Carl did not mention the envelope behind the battery box, did not mention the $14,000. He simply said, "It runs," and Tom nodded once and left. The years that followed did not bring sudden fortune. They brought the kind of steady pressure that breaks men slowly, and Carl used the 2390 for plowing, planting, pulling wagons during harvest, changing oil every 100 hours, replacing filters, greasing fittings, treating it not as a bargain, but as a responsibility. And when grain prices improved slightly in 1987, he paid down more of the mortgage. And when the drought hit in 1988 and yields dropped by 40%, he sold cattle. He had planned to keep and borrowed against the next crop and kept going. And the tractor kept going with him. Engine steady, no catastrophic failures, just the sound of work. In 1989, his wife Ellen was diagnosed with breast cancer, and the farm shifted from being only about acres and bushels to being about hospital drives to Springfield to hours, each way for surgery and chemotherapy. And Carl drove every trip, sat in waiting rooms, returned home late and still rose before dawn to feed livestock. And sometimes he would start the 2390 in the dark and let it idle for a minute longer than necessary, listening, because there was something steady in that sound when nothing else felt steady. He did not think of the tractor as salvation. He thought of it as one less thing that would fail him, and that mattered more than pride. By 1991 he was 47, 13 years into running the farm alone since his father's death. Mortgage nearly gone, machinery aging but functional, wife recovering slowly but not fully. And when he walked into the co-op one morning and heard Vernon say loud enough for others to hear, "Carl's still running that auction tractor," followed by a laugh. Carl paid for his parts and left without correcting him, because he knew something they did not, and because the field waiting for him did not care about opinion, only about whether the engine would start when he turned the key, and every time it did, clean and steady. The decision he made that April morning felt less like a gamble and more like an understanding that value and reputation are rarely the same thing, and that sometimes what saves a man is not brilliance or boldness, but the quiet choice to see what others overlook and then keep that knowledge to himself. Through the early 90s, the laughter about the auction tractor never fully stopped. It just changed tone, becoming a kind of background noise that followed Carl into the co-op, into church on Sundays, into short conversations at the grain elevator, and he learned to treat it the way he treated wind during harvest, something that moved around him but did not change what needed to be done. The 2,390 accumulated hours steadily, 5,000, then 7. And with every season that passed, the machine stopped looking like a risk and started looking like a fixture. Yet Carl never once mentioned the envelope behind the battery box, never once unfolded those receipts in front of another man, because the longer he kept that secret, the more it felt less like proof and more like a private understanding between him and a man who had lost everything. In 1993, Michael left for college in Chicago, the first in the family to go that far, and Carl drove him to campus in the same pickup he had used for seed runs and hospital trips. And as they unloaded boxes, Michael talked about finance, about opportunities in the city, about how farming was changing. And Carl listened without argument because he did not want his son to inherit obligation, disguised as tradition. And when he drove back alone, the farm felt larger than it had before, quieter. And that fall, the 2,390 pulled wagons through harvest dust without complaint, while Carl began to understand that survival sometimes meant letting go of what you assumed would continue. In 1994, the tractor needed a clutch rebuild, not catastrophic, not dramatic, just the kind of repair any machine with hours would eventually require. And Carl paid for it without resentment because he had never believed the 2,390 was indestructible, only that it had been given a second life by a man who had run out of time. Grain prices stayed low through much of the decade, input costs rose, and farms around Shelby County began to disappear one by one, sold to larger operations or split into parcels. And each auction Carl attended felt less like entertainment and more like a preview of what could happen if one season went wrong twice in a row. And every time he saw a man stand at the back of a lot the way he once had, hands in pockets, watching his life priced out in increments, Carl thought of Russell Hoffman and the $14,000 spent in hope rather than logic. In 1996, Russell died, a short obituary in the local paper listing survivors and little else. No mention of the bankruptcy, no mention of the farm, no mention of the tractor that had outlived him. And Carl folded the paper carefully and set it aside without comment, feeling neither triumph nor vindication, only the strange weight of knowing that the strongest part of Russell's final gamble was still working his fields. By 1997, the radiator on the 2,390 needed replacing, again a normal repair, and in 1999 the hydraulic pump required an overhaul. And each time Carl handled it the same way, as maintenance, not as failure, because the engine itself remained untouched, steady, almost stubborn in its reliability. And there were mornings when he would start it and remember the first time he had turned the key in the shed and heard that smooth idle. That did not match the story told about it. Ellen's health never fully returned to what it had been before cancer. She grew thinner, tired more easily, and though she sat on the porch in summer, watching him work the fields, she no longer walked them the way she once had. And Carl adjusted without ceremony, taking on more, speaking less, measuring success not in expansion but in continuity. And when neighbors talked about upgrading to newer equipment with better financing options, he would nod and change the subject because debt had taken Russell down and Carl had no interest in testing whether the same current still ran beneath the surface of the market. In 2003, at 59 years old, he was pulling a chisel plow in late March when the 2,390 began to lose power mid-pass, and for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something close to fear. Not because machines fail, but because this machine had become tied to too many seasons, too many hospital drives, too many quiet mornings. And he throttled down, checked the gauges, oil pressure fine, temperature fine, finished the pass and drove back to the shed. And when he pulled the air filter and found it clogged, he almost laughed at himself for assuming the worst, replaced it, restarted the engine, and felt the power return. That evening he ate dinner alone at the kitchen table, Ellen having gone to bed early, and it struck him with a clarity that surprised him that the tractor had outlasted nearly every prediction made about it, had outlasted the men who mocked it, had outlasted the reputation attached to its previous owner, and in some ways had become the most consistent presence in his working life. Vernon Kloss had stopped farming in 1999, sold his land to a corporate operation, and moved to Florida. And Carl heard about it from someone else, not with satisfaction, but with the quiet understanding that opinions age faster than machinery. When Ellen's illness returned years later in a form that could not be treated, Carl did not bargain with fate or make promises to God about acreage or yield. He drove her to appointments, sat beside her bed, and then buried her in the cemetery outside town next to his parents. And after the funeral, he went back to the farm because fields do not pause for grief. And the first morning, he started the 2,390 alone. He stood for a second longer than usual, with his hand on the steering wheel, not because the tractor could replace what he had lost, but because it was one of the few things that had not changed. Michael called once a month from Chicago, conversations brief, polite, built around weather and markets rather than memory. And when he visited in 2012 with his wife and 2 children, Carl barely knew. They walked through the farmhouse, looked at old photos, ate lunch in the kitchen, and afterward Michael asked to see the farm. And when they stood in the machine shed, and he pointed at the 2,390 and said, "You're still using that one?" Carl answered, "Every day." And when Michael shook his head and said, "Dad, that thing's got to be 30 years old," Carl corrected him quietly. 31, not as a defense but as a fact. And when his son asked, "When are you going to retire?" Carl did not answer, because he did not know how to explain that retirement from farming is less about age and more about absence, about who will care whether a machine starts in April. After they left that afternoon, and the house returned to its usual silence, Carl walked back out to the shed and stood in front of the tractor for a long time, thinking about the envelope still folded behind the battery box, thinking about Russell Hoffman spending $14,000. He did not have trying to hold on to something that ultimately slipped away, and thinking about how value is sometimes invisible not because it is small, but because it is inconvenient to see. He could have told Michael the story then, could have shown him the receipts and explained that what looked outdated had once been rebuilt with intention and sacrifice, but he chose not to, partly because he doubted it would change anything, and partly because the story had never been about proving someone wrong. It had been about carrying something forward quietly. By the time he turned 68, the tractor had logged over 14,000 hours, the paint nearly gone in places, the seat torn, the steering wheel worn smooth. Yet the engine still ran with the same steady tone that had first made him question the auction's verdict. And there were mornings when starting it felt less like operating equipment and more like acknowledging a promise that had held through drought, debt, illness, and the steady thinning of neighbors. The farm was paid off by then, but the fields felt heavier without Ellen and emptier without Michael, and Carl began to consider what it would mean to stop, to let someone else decide which machines were worth keeping and which were scrap. And that thought unsettled him more than any market fluctuation ever had, because he knew that whoever came next would see the 2,390 the way the crowd had seen it in 1984, as old, as replaceable, as something whose story did not matter unless someone chose to tell it. And Carl had never been a man inclined to tell his own story out loud. By 2008, Carl was 64 years old and beginning to understand that endurance has a different weight when there is no one left to share it. And that fall he attended another farm auction south of town, not because he needed equipment, but because auctions had become a way of measuring time, a way of seeing which names were disappearing from mailboxes and grain tickets. And as he walked past rows of newer tractors with enclosed cabs and clean paint, he felt neither envy nor regret, only distance, because the language of expansion no longer sounded like his own. He stopped near the back where older machines waited for smaller bids, and watched a young farmer raise his hand for an aging tractor that others ignored. And for a brief moment Carl saw himself standing at the back of a gravel lot, 24 years earlier, while men laughed, and he wondered whether that young farmer would be mocked later that week at the co-op, whether he would learn to ignore it, whether he would discover something no one else had bothered to check. When Carl returned home that evening, he parked in front of the machine shed and sat in the truck longer than necessary before stepping out, aware in a way he had not been before that there would come a season when he would not climb into the 2390 again, not because it failed, but because he would. In the years that followed, the farm continued the way it always had: planting in spring, harvesting in fall, machinery maintenance through winter. But the rhythm no longer felt endless, it felt numbered. And Carl began to take inventory not only of acres and equipment, but of what would remain. Once he stopped. Michael had made it clear during brief phone calls that he would not be returning to farm. His life in Chicago firmly established, his children growing up around traffic and offices rather than fields. And Carl did not resent him for that, though he sometimes wondered whether Michael understood that what looked like stubbornness from a distance had actually been a series of measured risks taken quietly. In 2012, when Michael visited again with his family and walked through the machine shed, running his hand across the hood of the 2390 and shaking his head at its age, Carl felt a small gap open between them that had nothing to do with machinery and everything to do with memory, because to Michael it was an outdated tool, and to Carl it was the engine that had pulled him through wet springs, drought summers, hospital winters, and long stretches of solitude. After they left that visit, Carl began to consider selling, not out of panic, but out of recognition that farming alone at 70 would not look the same as farming at 40. And in 2014 he listed the farm for sale, watching as a sign was placed at the edge of the road that had once felt permanent. Months passed with little serious interest, and during that waiting, Carl continued to work the fields as though nothing had changed. The 2390, still starting reliably each morning, still pulling its weight without drama. And sometimes he would find himself glancing at the battery box where the envelope remained hidden, wondering whether he should finally remove it, frame it, explain it. But each time he left it where it was, because the secret had never been about proving a point to others. It had been about understanding something privately. In August, a man named Aaron Dietrich called, 35 years old, farming with his father to counties over, looking to expand carefully rather than aggressively. And when Aaron walked the land, he asked practical questions about soil, drainage, yields, and then spent nearly an hour in the machine shed examining equipment with the kind of attention Carl recognized immediately. When Aaron stopped in front of the 2390 and asked, "Is that part of the sale?" Carl answered, "It can be," and started the engine so Aaron could hear it. And the steady idle filled the shed once more. The same sound that had silenced Carl's doubt 3 decades earlier. Aaron listened and said, "That sounds good for the hours." And in that moment Carl felt something close to relief. Not because someone had finally acknowledged the machine's worth, but because the next man in line was at least listening. They agreed on a price for the farm that November, and on the day Carl packed his tools, a few pieces of furniture, and boxes of papers into his truck. He stood one last time in the machine shed and looked at the 2390 not as a possession, but as a witness, a machine that had seen him at 40 and would not see him at 71. And when Aaron arrived to take possession, Carl handed him the keys to the house and the machinery, and then paused before saying, "There's an envelope behind the battery box, receipts from an engine rebuilt years ago. You might want to keep them." And Aaron nodded without asking further questions, understanding that some things are offered without explanation. Carl drove into town that afternoon and did not look back, not because he felt nothing, but because he knew that if he allowed himself to measure the distance, in the rearview mirror he might turn around. And in the small house he rented there were no sheds, no fields, no engines to start before dawn, only quiet rooms and routines that felt foreign at first. Months passed, then years, and though he no longer farmed, he still followed markets in the paper, still checked weather forecasts out of habit, and occasionally drove past his old land from a distance without stopping. In 2018, the phone rang one evening and Aaron's voice came through the line, steady but subdued, saying, "I wanted to let you know. The 2390 finally gave out. Transmission went. Not worth fixing." And Carl felt a tightening in his chest that surprised him with its sharpness. because he had known the machine was not immortal, and yet hearing its end spoken aloud felt like closing a chapter he had not been ready to name. "How many hours?" he asked, and Aaron answered, 18,200. And there was a pause before Aaron added, "I found those receipts you mentioned. Didn't know what I was buying back then. That tractor carried us through for seasons. I'm grateful." And Carl thanked him, hung up, and sat alone at his kitchen table looking out at a yard that held no equipment, no rows of corn. And he understood then that the engine Russell Hoffman rebuilt in desperation had run long enough to support to farms and to families across decades. Neither man could have predicted. The next year, Carl attended another machinery auction north of town, drawn there less by need than by memory. And near the back he saw a late 90s Magnum being bid on by a young woman relaying numbers over a phone, her voice steady as the price climbed. And he watched her win at 25,000 and walked to the cashier with a quiet smile. And he wondered whether anyone would mock her later, whether she would discover something hidden in that machine years from now, whether she would keep it to herself. And for the first time, he allowed himself to think that perhaps what matters most in a lifetime of work is not recognition, but continuation. The passing forward of something solid, even if the story behind it is never fully told. In January of 2023, when Carl Briner died at 79, the obituary in the local paper was brief and factual, listing his son Michael, two grandchildren, a sister in Ohio, and noting that he had farmed in Shelby County for over 3 decades. But it did not mention the 480 acres he had kept through the worst years of the farm crisis. It did not mention the long drives to Springfield during Ellen's chemotherapy. And it did not mention the case IH 2390 that had worked 18,000 hours across to families. Because machines do not appear in obituaries, and neither do the quiet decisions that hold a life together. Michael returned from Chicago to settle the estate, moving through the small house in town where his father had spent his final years, sorting through furniture, bank statements, old photographs, and boxes of papers that carried the smell of dust and time. And to him the task was administrative rather than emotional, because distance has a way of simplifying what it cannot fully understand. In one of those boxes he found a folded, grease-stained envelope with receipts dated from 1982 to 1983, listing parts and labor from a dealer in Mattoon, totaling nearly $14,000. And he looked at the name Russell Hoffman without recognizing it, looked at the description of pistons, bearings, turbocharger, injectors, and saw only outdated paperwork tied to a tractor that had already been scrapped. And without knowing the weight those pages had once carried, he tossed the envelope into a trash bag, with other documents that seemed no longer necessary. The case IH 2390 itself had been dismantled for years earlier, after the transmission failed. Sold for salvage, the body reduced to parts, the cab separated from the frame, the tires resold, and the engine Russell Hoffman rebuilt in a final attempt to save his own farm, and that Carl Briner discovered behind a battery box in 1984, had been pulled and sold to a man in Indiana who specialized in restoring old tractors. And whether that engine still runs somewhere under a different hood, pulling different soil, is something no one can confirm. What remains certain is that for 34 years the 2390 started when Carl turned the key. Through wet springs when planters sank, through drought summers when yields fell, through hospital winters when Ellen fought for her life, through quiet mornings when Michael no longer lived at home, and through the slow thinning of neighbors who sold out, moved south, or passed away. The tractor never made Carl rich, never expanded his acreage, never changed his standing at the co-op, and yet it became the one piece of equipment he never doubted, not because it was flawless, but because it had been built twice, once at the factory, and once in desperation by a man who refused to let it fail without a fight. There's a difference between buying something new and inheriting something rebuilt, and Carl understood that difference from the moment he unfolded those receipts on the concrete floor of his shed and realized that what others saw as junk carried the last investment of a man who believed one more season might change everything. Carl never told Vernon Kloss about the $14,000, never corrected the laughter, never used the envelope as proof that he had seen more clearly than the crowd, because by then the point was no longer to win an argument, but to keep moving forward. And in that silence there was a kind of discipline that few people notice and even fewer practice. After Ellen's death, after the mortgage was paid, after Michael chose a different life, Carl could have retired earlier, could have replaced the 2,390 with something newer, could have insisted that someone acknowledge that the so-called auction mistake had been anything but. Yet he did none of those things, choosing instead to let the machine speak through its hours and its reliability. When Aaron Dietrich called in 2018 to say the transmission was gone and the tractor would not be repaired, Carl did not argue for restoration or suggest sentiment. He simply asked about the hours and listened when Aaron said the tractor had carried them through for seasons and that he was grateful, and that gratitude, offered without fanfare, was the closest thing to recognition Carl ever received. In the end, there was no dramatic revelation at a town meeting, no public apology from the men who had laughed, no ceremony marking the final hour logged on the meter, only a scrapyard transaction and a quiet phone call and a man in a small kitchen absorbing the news that something steady in his life had come to a natural stop. If there is irony in that, it is not cruel but ordinary, because most of what sustains a person over decades leaves no visible monument, and most of what is mocked at first is forgotten by those who mocked it. Michael returned to Chicago after settling the estate, carrying with him photographs and legal documents, but not the envelope that might have explained why his father never reacted to criticism, why he corrected the tractor's age by a single year without elaboration, why he kept an aging machine long after others upgraded. To Michael, the receipts were outdated paperwork. To Carl, they had been context, evidence that effort invested in the face of failure can outlast the failure itself. The fields in Shelby County continue to be planted each spring by different hands. The equipment has grown larger, the financing more complex, and the names on mailboxes continue to change. But somewhere in Indiana, an engine rebuilt in 1982 may still be turning over at dawn. And if it is, it does so without knowing the men whose lives it steadied, without knowing the auction where it was dismissed, without knowing the envelope once folded behind a battery box. Carl Brenner's life did not hinge on proving anyone wrong. It hinged on seeing clearly and then doing the work required by that clarity. And though the receipts were thrown away and the tractor reduced to parts, the years it carried remain intact in the fields it helped plant and harvest, in the mortgage it helped retire, in the hospital bills it helped cover, and in the quiet example it set that value is not always loud, not always new, and rarely recognized in the moment. The story ends the way most real stories do, without applause, without full understanding, but with a simple fact that cannot be argued away. On April 17, 1984, a man stood at the back of an auction, raised his hand when no one else would, and trusted what he saw over what he heard. And for 34 years that decision proved steady enough to carry him through everything that followed. After Michael returned to Chicago, and the small house in town was emptied of what little remained, there was no final revelation waiting to surface, no neighbor arriving with a story Carl had never told, no hidden journal explaining his decisions, because Carl had never been a man who documented his inner life. He had lived it quietly and let it stand on its own. The farm he once owned continued under Aaron Dietrich's management, acres turning with the seasons as they always had, new equipment joining the lineup, older pieces phased out without ceremony, and somewhere in a salvage yard ledger the case IH-39 was reduced to a line item sold for parts, its cab separated, its frame cut down, its transmission judged not worth repairing. But the engine that Russell Hoffman rebuilt in 1982 and that Carl discovered 2 years later did not end its story in that yard. It was purchased by a man in Indiana who specialized in restoring older tractors, a man who believed that mechanical work done properly deserved another chance. And though neither Russell nor Carl ever knew his name, the engine left Illinois on a trailer one more time and was fitted into another machine that would work different soil under a different sky. There is something fitting in that, not poetic, not dramatic, simply consistent with the way effort moves through the world without asking permission. Because Russell had spent $14,000, he did not have enough final attempt to buy time. And though he lost his farm and later his life without public redemption, the precision of that rebuild carried forward into years he never saw, powering Carl through wet springs when other tractors spun out, through dry summers when yields dropped and margins thinned, through the long drives to Springfield when Ellen fought cancer, and Carl returned home after dark to finish chores under yard lights, and then carrying Aaron's family through for seasons of their own. The envelope that documented that work no longer exists, thrown away by a son who did not recognize its significance. And it would be easy to frame that as tragedy or misunderstanding. But the truth is simpler and heavier. Value does not disappear just because its proof is discarded. The hours logged, the acres planted, the debts reduced, the hospital bills paid, all remain facts even if the paper trail does not. Carl never intended his life to be a lesson. He never stood in a field imagining that someone might one day tell his story. And yet the pattern of his choices forms something clear in retrospect, a pattern built not on dramatic victories, but on measured decisions made without applause. When he stood at the back of that auction on April 17th, 1984, and raised his hand at $5,000 while others laughed, he did not know he was buying a machine that would anchor the next 34 years of his working life. He only knew that what he saw under the hood did not match what he heard from the crowd. And that difference between sight and sound, between inspection and assumption, became the quiet dividing line between him and the men who judged from a distance. Vernon Kloss moved to Florida and likely forgot about the red tractor he once mocked. Russell Hoffman's obituary never mentioned the rebuild that outlived him. And Michael returned to his office in Chicago without ever fully understanding why his father kept an aging machine long past the point of fashion. But none of those outcomes alter the central fact that the 2,390 ran when it needed to run, year after year, under to owners who depended on it more than they discussed it. In the final years of his life, Carl sometimes drove past his old fields without stopping, watching from the road as newer tractors crossed ground he once knew by memory. And there was no bitterness in that observation, only recognition that continuity does not require possession, that land and labor outlast any single name on a mailbox. If the engine in Indiana still turns over at dawn, the man operating it may never know that it once sat behind a battery box in Shelby County, with a folded envelope tucked out of sight, may never know that it survived the farm crisis of the 80s, a Midwestern drought, a woman's illness, and a farmer's quiet stubbornness. And perhaps that anonymity is appropriate, because neither Russell nor Carl worked for recognition. They worked to keep going. Stories like this rarely end with revelation. They end with dispersal. Parts separated, papers discarded, fields transferred. And the only true measure left is time, measured not in headlines, but in hours on a meter and years on a calendar. Carl Brenner's life does not fit into a single dramatic moment. It stretches across decades of ordinary mornings, when he turned a key and listened for a steady idle, before heading into work that would not announce itself beyond county lines. And in that steadiness there is a kind of strength that does not need validation. The men who laughed at the auction were not villains. They were simply operating from incomplete information, and Carl never corrected them because he understood something they did not yet grasp, that being right is less important than being durable. That proof shown too early often serves pride more than purpose, and that sometimes the strongest move is to let time argue on your behalf. When the transmission failed in 2018 and Aaron chose not to repair it, that decision was practical, not sentimental, and Carl did not object because he knew that even the most reliable machine has an endpoint, and what mattered was not preserving metal, but acknowledging what it had already carried. The receipts may be gone, the tractor dismantled, the farm under new management, but the consequences of that single raised hand in 1984 remain woven into seasons that followed, into the mortgage paid off, into the medical bills cleared, into the quiet dignity of a man who never needed the crowd to revise its opinion. And so the story closes not with a dramatic reveal, but with a simple, unembellished truth. A farmer once bought what others dismissed, inspected it for himself, kept his findings private, and allowed decades of consistent work to speak in place of explanation. And if somewhere an old engine still starts cleanly before sunrise, that sound carries forward a decision made in the face of laughter, steady and unremarked, just as Carl would have preferred.